Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I'm here to host tonight's event with historian Tom Wetzel in conversation with community organizer James Tracy about Wetzel's latest book, Overcoming Capitalism: Strategy for the Working Class in the 21st Century. Before we start, if this is your first time joining an event with us, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 14-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're an anarchist collective that is well known for our curated inventory of titles related to feminism, queerness, social movements, and radical politics. We ship books all across the country and around the world, so if you haven't checked us out yet, our full catalog is available on our website, which I will drop links to in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space. However, due to the ongoing global pandemic, we continue to hold our community and author events entirely online. With that said, we do have a list of exciting virtual events coming up. In July, we're hosting other PM Press authors like William Robinson to discuss his book, Global Civil War, Capitalism Post-Pandemic, as well as John P. Clark to discuss the second edition of his book, The Impossible Community, Realizing Communitarian Anarchism. So if you're interested in signing up for those or any other events through Firestorm, you can follow us on social media, and I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. A note for those attending in the live audience, tonight's speakers are excited to field your questions. So if you're interested in asking anything at any point, I'll encourage you to submit questions throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen if you're attending on Zoom, or in the comments if you're following along on the Facebook live stream. Great. Moving on to tonight's event and speakers. In Overcoming Capitalism, Tom Wetzel carefully explains the intricacies of capitalism and how the economic structure is stacked against everyday people, with an eye toward where power lies and how the working class can tip the scales. It's written for everyone, not just a specialized self-selected audience, but for anyone with a stake in wresting power away from the wealthy elite and strategizing for how the powerless can get the upper hand. Tom Wetzel has written on labor history, worker struggles, libertarian socialist ideas, and housing struggles since the 1970s. He's been published by ZNet and ROAR Magazine and is a former editor of the anarcho-syndicalist magazine Ideas and Action, where many of his essays were published. James Tracy is a community organizer in the Bay Area. He is co-founder of the San Francisco Community Land Trust, which uses public and private money to buy up housing stock and take it out of the real estate market. And is also a poet and co-author of Hillbilly Nationalists, Urban Race Rebels, and Black Power. So Tom, James, thank you so much for taking the time to be here tonight and to share your insights. And I am gonna go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thank you so much for having us. Wish we could be doing this in real life at one of the best independent anarchist bookstores on the face of the planet, but this will do. My name is James Tracy. Tom Wetzel and I have been friends for about 20 years now. We actually co-founded the San Francisco Community Land Trust years ago as a response to this displacement crisis. So Tom, my first question for you is, you are entering your 6th decade of being a former Republican. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and and what brought you to write this book?
Well, I grew up in a working class family in Los Angeles, and when I graduated from high school, I worked as a blue collar worker for years, working in gas station lube bays, working with a variety of people, a lot of Black men who influenced my ideas and things like that. And so that's kind of where I came from. And I think it was probably around the early 70s I began to develop socialist ideas. And it's interesting because here's one thing that's relevant is that one of the books that influenced me a lot was Bertrand Russell's little book, Roads to Freedom, which he wrote in 1918 and he has a chapter on each of the different socialist strategies and politics of that era, Marxism and Kropotkin and guild socialism, syndicalism. And it was very clearly written, and I think that it's good to have a kind of introductory book of this kind that in clear language sort of goes over the pros and cons of the main different radical strategies, radical socialist strategies. And that's sort of what I tried to do in this main part of the book. The central part of the book is 5 chapters on strategy, where I just discuss, each of the different main strategies nowadays, like, electoral socialism, trying to build an electoral socialist party, that kind of thing. The communist movement and its ideas about the vanguard party and cooperativism, building alternative institutions, as well as, looking at the ideas about how do we revive the labor movement, and explaining also what syndicalism is, and why, and trying to defend it. So that's kind of the core part of the book, I think.
So what does 21st century syndicalism look like?
Well, okay, syndicalism is basically a self-organization strategy where workers try to build grassroots unions that they control themselves through their meetings, through the election of shop stewards or shop delegates who work there in the workplace with them, so the leadership is on the job. And it's focused a lot on the immediate resistance to management, countering management's control over us, and building a union that through both the general meetings of the workers, of the members, as well as elected delegates, remains under the control of workers themselves. That's like a key thing, is the self-management of the union. Another key aspect, there's really 3 components here. One is emphasizing direct participation in direct struggle, disruptive action like strikes, occupations, things of that kind, as being, because it puts the people who are affected by the issues directly at the center and are able to control their own struggles. And the third element is the idea of widening out solidarity, so that the different the working classes are very, very diverse, and there are various different social movements and struggles around the issues and grievances of the different groups of people who make up the working class, around tenants issues and racist police violence, various things. And so the sort of principle of solidarity, a widening solidarity, the principle of solidarity is encapsulated in the slogan, "An injury to one is an injury to all." So the idea there is to develop links between different unions, different social movements, develop links between unions and the various social movements to move towards building a kind of social movement alliance, as I call it. And so this is where, and I think that because of the diversity of problems, of issues, of forms of oppression that have come to the fore, say over the last century or 70 or 80 years, that grassroots unionist basis, a syndicalist kind of approach to trying to get rid of capitalism is going to have to take account of all the different grievances and issues of the various subgroups of the working class and bring people together to build a social movement alliance. And that's, I think, the way in which it will, that a movement today will probably look somewhat different than syndicalism in like the World War I era or the 1930s. So they had also, even back then, there were some, different social movements that were often linked in with radical union movements.
Great. So let's say this movement is successful, gains enough support amongst working class people, and wins, it transforms society, has a revolution. What's daily life going to look like under the best case scenario?
Well, here is where I think that you have to look at the basic idea of syndicalism and libertarian socialism. Socialism is to rebuild all the social institutions of the society on the basis of self-management and of people having equal access to all the resources they need for their personal development. So I think that we can kind of look at two areas where you would want to have as a base of self-management. One is the workplace, so that workers have to take over the running of the various workplaces and link them together across the industry, coordination and planning for that industry. And the other location would be in the community, because there are many issues related to the economy, related to how the society works, that affects people primarily, or in general, people in general, not just people in particular workplaces. So for example, the ecological crisis, like global warming, affects everyone. And the pollutants would affect people throughout a community, throughout a city or region. And so, and there's the whole issue of the economy, the production system has to be accountable to the masses of people. That's part of the social in socialism, right? And so there has to be, therefore, things like neighborhood assemblies and community-wide Congress to work out what are the kinds of social services, social goods, social benefits we want, like what kind of housing and what kind of built environment do we want to live within in the city, and these kinds of things. And this is what I call the dual governance model. There's both a basis of general community control over the issues that affect the general population in a particular neighborhood, particular community, region, and also there's control by workers over the workplaces. Workers have to have control over the workplaces, the places where they work, because if they don't, then we know that there will be some other class over them. In that case, the working class will not have liberated itself from some form of class oppression. And that's one of the lessons of socialism in the 20th century, I think.
So let's pick up on the thread about broadening out solidarity. How would your vision relate to some of the defining social movements of this time? For example, the movement for Black Lives, the Land Back movement, and the fight against gender oppression.
Well, the thing is here that gender inequality, racial inequality, they don't just exist out there in the community, they also come into workplaces. You have problems of sexual harassment, racial discrimination within workplaces, and so struggles. So we're talking here about the relationship between a revived and genuinely democratic labor movement and these other kinds of and other social movements that arise. Then the labor organizations have to be willing to take up these issues that arise in the larger community, whether it be racist police violence or tenant struggles, and just to take a couple of examples, in two struggles I was involved in, we had a case in one workplace of gay bashing, where there was gay workers formed a group, and other workers in that place, other employees, threatened to come and beat them up at their meetings. we had to defend them. And, you know, in another case, a worker who was HIV positive, they were going to fire him because the employers were worried about the effects on their insurance costs. We had to actually take action. The whole workplace there had to take action, direct action actually, and we did successfully force the employer to say, no, we will keep this person. So, I mean, you know, so this is an example of how issues that are social in nature enter into and affect also the struggle within workplaces. So there isn't really like a, you know, impervious wall between them, right? And that's a basis for why you need a labor movement that is basically anti-racist and feminist in its character, you know.
Yeah, I mean, today is the 88th anniversary, I believe, of Bloody Thursday, when the National Guard killed 2 longshoremen in San Francisco. I went to an event this morning at the longshoremen's commemoration. I was really touched by how clear many of the speakers were about urging people to take police brutality and police murder, you know, especially the racist variety, as seriously as if they were strikers that were killed in the streets. And I really thought that was refreshing to hear, you know, and I would love to see unions and workers' centers take up those issues with a little bit more vigor.
Right.
So you know, I love your book. I think it's you know, I've read just about every iteration of it. I've had the honor of you sharing your different chapters with me over the past 10, 12 years since you've been working on it. I love it because even at the parts where I disagree with it, or you know, just slightly, of course, it's a vision of what we want, right? It's a vision of something to fight for instead of only facing on the necessary reactive struggles that, of course, we have to deal with. I think that's a really good example. So why do you spend so much time in this book dealing with Leninists or electoral democracy? Why don't you just, you know, expand the Tom Wetzel the Tom Wetzel magic of talking about a world that was worth living on? I mean, anybody who follows you on Facebook can get your gripes about the Leninists.
Well, I think that it has these are people who are seriously advocating, you know, like we take electoral socialism. That's a very dominant tendency today. You know, Democratic Socialists of America is the largest socialist organization for a long time in the US, and many of them, like the people in the Bread and Roses caucus in that organization, propose a kind of Kautsky-like electoral socialist strategy. Their strategy is that we can build socialism through elections. So you have to take seriously what they are saying, and not just simply brush them off. You know, you have to look at the pros and cons of what they are saying. Now, my arguments there in that case was that the problem historically is that electoral socialism tends to build up a kind of bureaucratic layer of party, you know, elected officials, party operatives, a whole party organization. And it's similar to the problem of the bureaucratization of the unions, like in the AFL-CIO unions, where the officials at the top tend to develop different interests from rank and file working people. And that will actually end up being a barrier because they will be opposed to advancing the struggle in various ways, you know, advancing extensions or, you know, widening out of struggles to, you know, to greater confrontations with the system, right? They want to try to focus things onto their preferred channel of electoral politics. So I think that you do have to take seriously what people who, you know, put a lot of effort into thinking about they have a strategy, right? And they put a lot of effort into thinking about it. So you have to take them seriously by evaluating what they said.
Wow. Probably one of the strongest arguments for engaging in the electoral process to a heavy degree is one that I hear from my students at City College all the time. It's like, yeah, we get it. We don't like the electoral system one bit, but the world's burning, and we need to get the worst people in the world's hands off the levers of power. How would you talk to a young person by that? Would you tell them just forget about voting? Are you anti are you against people voting for people like AOC and other progressives?
Not at all. I mean, people are going to, working class people are going to look at the electoral system in terms of its practical impact. And it does make a difference in many cases that, we want some reactionary out of there. We want that person defeated because their victory would be damaging to us, to our interests, to our immediate situation. So it makes perfect sense that people would, in many cases, want to vote for someone who they think would be, be better for them in terms of the immediate situation in society. So no, I'm not saying people should vote. It's the question here of what the strategy is, the long-term vision of how we go about building for a change over to a, socialist, worker-controlled socialism. What I'm saying is that we have to put our emphasis on the direct participation, building direct struggles, direct activity, direct action of working people themselves. That is where the emphasis has to be. This is not saying, what people should vote for, who they should, or that they shouldn't vote.
This is actually a nice segue. And for those of you in the audience, we're kind of winding down at this part, and would welcome your questions. Please use the Q&A feature of Zoom because the chat is disabled. We'll try to get as many as possible. Don't mean tweet me if I skip over one of them by accident. It happens. There's a lot of people names in the audience whose work in writing I respect a lot. So hey, Derek Shannon, love your work. So yeah, let's start to wind down a little bit. I think a segue from our last questions about unions. You make and have made a really strong case for building new unions, which is a discussion that's been made all the more relevant by the emergence of Amazon union and the Starbucks upsurge and Striketober. It's almost like you're like the prophet of labor or something like that, but that sounds a little too religious there. But you definitely got your finger on something. So for those of us who work at workplaces that have existing unions, those of us who are seeking unions, work at places that are being organized by existing unions, should we just give them the finger and walk away and go organize something new? Is it that simple?
If you're talking about the situation where there is one of the AFL-CIO unions is entrenched as a contract, as recognition. This is only, of course, 6% of the workers in the private sector right now. It's actually less than in 1900. So it's like going back to the beginning. That's the situation we're in today. But if you are in that situation, there are ways that you can organize to affect what happens by doing things like building an independent worker committee, worker organization, to bird dog what the officials are doing, to mobilize people against like sellout contracts. Good example of that is the organization Railroad Workers United. And they are independent of the several craft unions in the railroad industry. There's the conductors union, the locomotive engineers union, and so on. And they have been able to successfully mobilize people to maintain solidarity between the crafts. So for example, there was an attempt by the conductors union, used to be UTU, it's SMART now, to basically sell out the locomotive engineers by agreeing to automation So the conductors would like use, battery powered controllers to run the engines. And so basically get rid of the other people, right? And so they were able to mobilize 5,000 people in their union to vote no on that, and they defeated it. So that's an example of what an independent worker organization can do in the situation where you do have the entrenched bureaucratic unions.
Great. I mean, I do work. I'm part of a union that has made some pretty great electoral gains and workplace gains. Partially by electing some decent people that wouldn't sell us out. That's why City College of San Francisco is tuition free right now because of social justice, unionism, but also electing people that actually embrace that. I have one more question before we open up the Q&A. And since this Firestorm is an anarchist bookstore, I think that one of your chapters that might be most intriguing towards anarchists is your description of the two approaches to prefigurative politics, themes that we've already touched upon. But I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about that for those in the audience.
Okay, but basically I make a distinction there between different kinds of organizations to self-manage resources like cooperatives or communal land trusts versus organizations of struggle. And they have historically led to two different conceptions of the way that building things today sort of prefigures a change in the future. With syndicalism, it's, you build those self-managed unions, and your idea is that eventually you have a movement that's powerful enough, organized enough, has a united front among large numbers of community organizations, so that workers can take over the direct management of the places where they work. So that's one kind of prefiguration, right? Now, the other idea is forming cooperatives, worker cooperatives. And here, I think the problem here is that capitalism has historically tended to degenerate or diminish the potential of the cooperative sector. The cooperative sector has always been very marginal. There are kind of structural reasons for that within capitalism. Capitalism itself, the market is basically a transmission belt of oppression. If companies, are able to compete by lowering wages, by polluting, then everybody is forced to do that within capitalism. And you see that the destructive effects on many cooperatives, like the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain, for example, have created subsidiaries in Poland and Morocco, paying people much lower wages, no co-op rights whatsoever. And we had the same problem a few years back, like 20, 30 years ago, with the plywood co-ops in the Pacific Northwest, doing the same kind of thing. On the other hand, there's not exactly a hard and fast line here, because there have historically been some examples of cooperatives that are actually used as a strike tactic, as a struggle tactic. A contemporary example today is the new driver cooperative in New York City, which has built its own online ride-sharing platform to compete with Uber and Lyft. It's essentially an attack by the drivers against the companies that were exploiting them. So you can see that's an example of using a cooperative as a struggle tactic. And there in the past there have been various other examples of that, like the co-op newspapers that striking newspaper workers formed, for example. So it's not exactly like there's a hard and fast line, but I would say that there are limitations to the cooperative sector in terms of being a vehicle for the shift to socialism, to a socialized economy. That's why you need to have basically the movements of struggle, the unions and other mass organizations of struggle need to be like the central components, because that's where the working class gains the power to change things.
That resonates a lot with me. My very first job as a young person was throwing newspapers back when there was such a thing as paper boys for a cooperative run newspaper. So we have a great question in the Q&A, and I encourage people to add more great questions. So for this one's from CC. That touches on one of the most critical issues facing us around disability. I'm going to read the whole thing out. In the face of complete failure of federal, state, and local governments to address mass infection and disablement with COVID, have folks seen workers organizing to push the workplaces to adopt health and safety measures beyond mass vaccine requirements, such as air quality monitoring, upgrading HVAC infrastructure, ventilation, and filtration measures, as well as increased paid sick leave and health insurance? Tom.
There have been a number of unions, number of struggles in particular industries where this has actually come up as a major issue, a major health and safety demand in strikes, in fact. Now, unfortunately, I can't remember off the top of my head where a particular example of this, but I know there have been several cases of this that have gone on in this country and even in other countries too.
Great. And I do know that several jobs with justice chapters across the country have taken the track of organizing for local legislation, especially around paid sick leave, and has won a few of those pieces of legislation. All right. I think we might have. Oh, here we go. All right. So we have a question directly from Firestorm Books and Coffee, which we thank again for having us on over today's. So can you tell us a little bit more about worker organizing, social movements, and people's assemblies, the relationship between?
Well, people's assemblies, like community assemblies.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by people's assemblies? Yes. There have been some examples of that. One of the examples I know of is in Los Angeles, where there's been organizing like against ICE that way in immigrant communities through people popular assemblies. I can't offhand think of recent cases, not in this country anyway, of relationships to unions, though I think there have been in, say, France and some other, and Spain, some other countries, where some of the more radical unions have had connections to these movements that arose through popular assemblies in particular neighborhoods or in the city center. It is a possibility. It is definitely a possibility.
Great. So I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. I hope we hope that there's a few more here. We have a little more time with each other, if you like. All right. Well, hearing none, I'm going to move to my next question. So, what are some of the ideas on your cutting room floor that maybe were edited out of this book that you might like to write in your next book?
Oh, I had to cut 60,000 words out of this book. I had whole sections on. I got a section on gender inequality. I had a section on worker internationalism. I had a case study of the intense bureaucratization of the United Auto Workers Union. And I also had a chapter on the Spanish Revolution in the 1930s. So these are some of the things that I'm thinking about maybe putting together into another book, down the road.
All right, good. We're looking forward to it. So if anybody here just can't get enough of Tom Wetzel, go to the Books to the Barricades Facebook page on Sunday, 5:00 Pacific, where Tom will be in conversation with the fantastic cooperative organizer and anarchist Leslie Leba. and I hope that it'll be sponsored by Green Arcade, another wonderful bookstore. And we have a new question that I'm going to read out, and this will be the one we will take us out for this afternoon. A lot of recent gains in union organizing seem to be in workplaces that have a lot of direct interaction amongst staff, service industries, etc. What are some strategies for larger corporate unionizing where staff are more separated and stratified? That from Justin.
Yeah, that makes things more difficult. But even in the case of, like, if you think of like the Amazon labor union victory at the warehouse in Staten Island, so Amazon drivers go out and, and they're outside a lot. And so they had to have a way to have conversations with them. And Justine Medina was one of the organizers, people in the organizing committee. So they used every single thing they could think of, as a way to, whether, outside the workplace, contacting them at home or whatever, to be able to have the necessary conversations. Because it is true that in order to be able to organize, particularly a worker-controlled union, you need to have lots of conversations. You need to, there are different groups. Any kind of large company, large enterprise is very diverse nowadays, and you need to be able to figure out what is important for all the different groups of people in that workplace, right? So, and that can be that, and if people are in different locations and spread out, that can be difficult. That can be difficult to arrange. So, and I don't necessarily have all the answers to how to solve that problem. You have to sort of use, try to innovate, figure out some ideas there.
Great. Well, I guess we'll close first by saying thanks, Tom, for writing this book. I think it's going to inspire lots of needed conversations about the future, which I hope is something that I hope we still have. And I'm probably not the only person getting a little anxious, but a gentle reminder to everybody here that we do live under capitalism, unfortunately, still. And contrary to the stereotype, institutions like Firestorm Books and AK Press do not exist because of people's trust funds. They exist because you buy books from them. So please keep these things around, and and buy a book. You will be glad you did. I will turn this over to Ash.
Thanks so much, James, and thanks so much, Tom, for taking the time to talk with us tonight. For folks here tonight, I did just drop in the chat a link to the book. It is a very timely and important book for the moment, so I do hope you'll pick up a copy and read it. And everyone who is registered for this event, I just saw a question, you will get a link to a recording of the event, so lots of good information here tonight. You will be able to watch it again in the future. So yeah, thanks again so much to both Tom and James for being here tonight, and would love to see you again somewhere down the line.
Hopefully in person. Right on. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much, y'all. Have a good evening. Goodbye now.
Bye.